1948, the people of Berlin were on the verge of starvation, deprived of fuel, food, and power. However, Berliners were able to survive as a result of American and British actions.
And if we didn't do what we did in 1948 and 49, we wouldn't be sitting here today, or if we were, we'd be speaking Russian.
President Harry S. Truman's administration was involved in the Cold War, in which the Soviet Union and the United States, previously allies, were now pitted against each other. The Berlin Airlift was a turning point in the Cold War, triumphing over the Soviets in their attempt to starve Berlin of resources, amplifying the already high political tensions between the Soviet Union and Western powers, and eventually leading to the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the building of the Berlin Wall. The end of World War II brought Germany to ruins and chaos. The Potsdam Conference in July and August of 1945 sectioned Germany into 4 zones of occupation: British, French, American, and Russian. However, the capital, Berlin, was located inside the Russian zone in East Germany. Thus, it was decided that the Soviet Union would maintain control over East Berlin, while the western half would be divided among the 3 Allied powers. Beginning in the summer of 1948, Joseph Stalin, the ruler of the Soviet Union, began a blockade of Berlin in an attempt to consolidate control of the city and pressure the Allies to leave Germany. Attempting to starve the city of Berlin, the Soviets blocked roads, canals, and railroads into it, cutting off all travel arriving from the west. Finally, the Russians blocked the food supply from the Soviet to the Allied zones. According to a 1975 report on the Berlin Airlift, quote, "Berlin became virtually a besieged city, an island cut off from the rest of the world, entirely surrounded by the Soviet zone."
The Russians had completely closed off all forms of traffic, and the city of Berlin was an isolated island.
Because the Berlin blockade blocked both land and sea transport into Berlin, there was no possible way to feed the people inside except by air. President Truman's administration called for a military response to the blockade, but he refused, concerned that such action might cause a Third World War. Instead, he organized an airlift of supplies under General Lucius D. Clay, the American military governor of Germany. Clay was determined to combat the Soviet blockade and remain in Germany, saying, quote, "They can't drive us out of Berlin by anything short of war." Brigadier General Joseph Smith became the Berlin Airlift Task Force commander, naming it Operation Victuals. The Royal Air Force in Britain created a nearly identical operation, Operation Plainfare. The official mission of the Berlin Airlift was to, quote, "supply the island of Berlin with the necessities of life by air." The Berlin Airlift was an attempt to triumph over the tragedy occurring in the city. The first planes of the Berlin Airlift took off from England and Western Germany on June 6, 1948. The operation began with approximately 100 Douglas C-47 Skytrains. However, by July 15th, Operation Victuals grew to become a massive operation, with 2,500 tons of supplies, primarily coal and food, being delivered every day. On October 15, 1948, Operation Victuals and Plainfare joined to become the Combined Airlift Task Force under General William H. Tunner.
General Turner was our commander, and he was the one, he knew air transport, and he did a good job.
Yes, he did.
Everything we needed was there waiting for us to go on the airplane.
Several problems were encountered throughout the course of the airlift. However, the United States' persistence in the face of these obstacles demonstrated the extent of their commitment to overcoming this tragedy. One potentially dangerous problem was the heavy traffic at the airports and air bases. This heavy traffic additionally caused many issues regarding radio transmission confusion, requiring many separate radio frequencies. To help alleviate the difficulty of organizing this complicated operation, a standardization board to regulate and make consistent the techniques pilots used to fly the planes was formed. Other problems arose from the airplanes themselves. The Skymasters used in the airlift were not built for frequent short-distance flights carrying heavy cargo. The planes were often in need of repair due to worn-out tires, burned brakes, and fractured metal pieces. As a result of the sheer magnitude of the airlift, there was a shortage of parts and no way to fix some of the aircraft. As a solution, supply and maintenance procedures were established for the Airlift Task Force, using the Erding Air Force Depot as the main supply facility. 2 of the most common types of American planes used in the Berlin Airlift were Douglas C-47 Skytrains and Douglas C-54 Skymasters. The largest planes used in the airlift were the Boeing C-97 Stratofreighter and the Douglas C-74 Globemaster. These aircraft would take off from one of 8 airfields in the western zones. The U.S. Air Force bases in Frankfurt would dispatch planes to Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. Planes flying from the British air bases would land in either Gatow or Tegel Airport. General Tunner created an extraordinarily efficient operation, establishing a 24/7 system in which planes would fly into and out of Berlin at a constant pace. This extremely organized operation consisted of pilots and crews on each plane, as well as people on each end of the journey loading and unloading the supplies. In the air bases in Western Germany, loaders had 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. While many of these loaders were from the American military, former German Air Force mechanics were also hired to help. In addition, people on either side of the airlift kept inventory of all the supplies that went on and off of the airplanes, signing documentation to ensure that every item was accounted for. Despite these meticulous planning and verification methods, planes hardly spent longer than an hour in Berlin.
It was just the most well-coordinated operation known till that day.
The winter of 1948 to 49 was a true indication of the deep commitment of the Allies to triumph over the Berlin blockade and succeed in saving a city with a population of over 2 million. That winter brought extremely dangerous flying conditions in which, ordinarily, all flights would have been stopped. In fact, the Soviets were convinced that the combined airlift task force would give up and end the operations. However, the US and British refused to let the tragedy continue. The Berlin airlift, despite its many obstacles, was an incredibly impressive feat and humanitarian triumph. American and British planes carried several tons of food each day, totaling over 2.3 million tons in the course of nearly 270,000 flights. The majority of these supplies were coal and food. However, other vital resources like medicine were also brought to Berlin. The total cost of the American portion of the Berlin airlift was about $290 million, most of which was paid for through taxes. Another example of the great sacrifices made was the death of 31 Americans and 39 British crew members as a result of plane crashes. These tragic deaths were part of the cost of saving 2.5 million lives. On April 16th, Easter of 1949, General Tunner decided to attempt to fly a plane into Berlin every minute. This unprecedented undertaking broke the record for a quantity of supplies in a single day, totaling 12,941 tons. During this Easter parade, planes landed, on average, every 63 seconds. An Allied counter-blockade opposing the Soviet one cut off trade with East Germany, making it difficult for the Soviets to continue their blockade. In addition, their international image had worsened greatly as a result of the tragic and inhumane evil they imposed on Berlin. Thus, they gave up on May 12, 1949, lifting the blockade. However, the airlift continued in order to ensure that the Berliners would keep receiving resources in the case of a resumption of the Soviet blockade. Finally, on August 1st of 1949, the liquidation of the Berlin airlift began. The airlift was gradually reduced over about 3 months, stopping completely on October 31st. Operation Vittles greatly improved the international image of the United States, especially in Berlin and the rest of Germany. This American triumph was a defeat for the Soviet Union. They had utterly failed in their goal of starving Berlin and getting the Allies out of Germany. Instead, East Berlin was absorbed into East Germany, and West Berlin remained a separate territory with its own government. Another result of the Berlin airlift was a heightening of the tension between the forces of communism in the East and of democracy in the West. As a result of this division, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was formed on April 4, 1949. In addition to the immediate results of the Berlin airlift, it had a lasting impact on Germany, especially in Berlin. Partially as a result of the airlift, the western sector of Berlin prospered, creating an economic gap between East and West Berlin. Many Easterners began commuting to West Berlin in search of better job opportunities, higher wages, and improved living standards. The East German government felt that this potential loss of many valuable members of society threatened the welfare of East Germany. Thus, they set up the Berlin Wall as a way to prevent movement from the east to the west. This dividing wall in Berlin remained until 1989. The Berlin airlift managed to sustain the lives of over 2 million residents of Berlin for nearly 17 months. This remarkable feat of the Air Force was a massive success and a triumph over the Soviet-imposed tragedy in Berlin.